Okay, good morning, everybody. Nice to see you, and thank you for asking me to talk. And thanks to João for some really interesting ideas, some of which I'll pick up on, and some of which I will not, because they're too clever for me. So I want to talk a little bit about what we hear when we listen to a cylinder. So when we look at something through a lens, it's very common, very typical for humans to forget the presence of the lens, and they focus on the actual subject that they're looking at. And so they don't really factor in the potential influence of the lens on what they're seeing. And the same thing, of course, happens with sound recording. We often focus very much on the subject of the sound recording, and we forget about the influence of the thing that's delivering the sound to us. So and we think of the carrier as being the issue here, but really it's not just the carrier, it's the technology and its users. So we listen to a carrier, but we also listen to a machine playing something, and we're listening to the results of what the humans did at the time. So it's a system, and I always like to try and remember that we're listening to a system and the subjectivity that's built into that. So how well do early ethnographic recordings represent their subject, and in what ways? This is a kind of recurrent question for me in everything I do in my research, and it applies also when I listen to commercial recordings. In what ways do they and do they not reflect the culture that they pretend to represent or they promise to represent? There's some obvious ways in which early sound recordings affect what you're listening to. So the limited frequency range, the limited dynamic range, of course, as far as what we 21st century people hear. So how should we understand what we're hearing? One way of tackling that question is to triangulate by comparing early ethnographic recordings with comparable fields. That could be early commercial recording, or it could be modern day field recordings, and to see in which ways they're similar, in which ways they differ, and why. Is there anything that we can recognize from that? Despite my title here, I'm going to drift slightly broader than cylinders in a way that will make sense in a moment, I hope. So one of the first areas, and this is a painful area, this is a tender thing to prod for some of us, but the technical expertise of the people making the recordings was often rather limited, certainly if you compare it to commercial recording people at the time. The focus if you're a subject specialist in any field, then your focus is on the subject. Your focus is not necessarily on the means of capturing the subject. And you can hear this very often in early ethnographic recordings. One obvious way is the fact that they dropped the cutter a little late, or they started the machine rather late, and you can hear the wow as the machine kind of grabs up to speed when it's recording. And in many other ways, when you compare, I mean, as Duncan will explain to us in some detail later, the differences between making a vertical cut ethnographic recording on a cylinder machine and making a lateral cut recording for a commercial enterprise are quite different in many ways, but broadly speaking, in my experience, I'm going to get a far better frequency response in a commercial recording than I am in an ethnographic recording. There's all kinds of reasons for that, but one of them, of course, is that the commercial engineer, his job or his salary depends on his ability to capture sounds well, and usually he's working in a particular field where the person being recorded is in some way a professional performer. He has some understanding of the instruments he will record, and perhaps has more control over the environment in which the recording is made, more control over the person being recorded than the ethnographic field worker who's perhaps doing things for the first time. There's an interesting record from a very fascinating character who we're going to hear about later tomorrow, I think actually, from Simon Hayes' paper on Lily Fraser, who is a key figure in early ethnographic recording in the UK. I've often, whenever I come across her, I think, why doesn't someone do some proper research on Lily Fraser? And I was very excited when I saw the program for tomorrow, and we're going to hear a paper about Lily Fraser. But one thing, she was the wife of Sir James Fraser, armchair anthropologist, very prominent in the UK, who wrote The Golden Bough. Her role is not fully uncovered yet, but she was clearly a very great organizer. She, in the background of his work, was involved in coordinating and assisting ethnographers in the UK to make recordings, but she also gathered them in and collected them. It's not entirely clear yet, but she may have been the first deliberate sound archivist in the UK. There's many people who were accidental sound archivists, like record companies and so on, but in terms of people who intended to create a repository of sound recordings for scientific use and actually going about doing it, she may have been the first person. We shall see. But she made a very interesting note in a letter to the Reverend John Roscoe in about 1918. Actually, it was her husband, Sir James, that wrote the letter, but he passed on his wife's advice. The Reverend Roscoe was thinking of making some sound recordings, and she had said, she suggested that he must practice for a long time beforehand to get the best results. The difference between those who trained to use it and those who did not is, quotes, patent to any listener. And she's quite right. Another way in which ethnographers, in their enthusiasm to grasp the subject and not grasp the full system, what they're doing, is the poor or incomplete metadata. They very rarely wrote enough information about what they'd recorded and how. Often you'll get information about who and where, perhaps, and maybe what, but very little on the how. This is evident on the lack of information on the boxes of cylinders very often, but also paperwork elsewhere. And I have to say, this is a very common experience for anyone who's worked with modern day field work done by other people as well. Whether this be in ethnography or in social history, I have to say oral historians are often particularly poor in writing down the technical parameters of what they have done. I've worked with probably thousands of cassettes made by oral historians, and the number of times they have ticked the box that said Dolby noise reduction, yes or no, is perhaps there's that many times I've seen it done. You just need to tell me whether you used Dolby or not. But they did not tell me that because they were not focused on the technical parameters, and it's the same with the ethnography field in the early days. Technical expertise of the recorded subject also differed greatly. For those of us who were here yesterday and the day before, and for what we're about to see from the display, now it will be very, very clear that the performer must perform in a particular way in order to assist the recording process when you're using a horn and a diaphragm system. So one of the most obvious ways that that's important is with the proximity to the horn itself. So the system of the horn connected to the diaphragm and connecting to the cutter is relative to modern day technology is highly insensitive and highly partial. So the arrangement around the horn of performers is a very subtle and very complex and very controversial art. This diagram here is one prepared by William Sinclair Darby, who was a commercial recording engineer and expert for the gramophone company, and he made this in about 1907. He wrote a letter back to the UK branch very excitedly from Berlin saying, I have now perfected the arrangement of musicians around the horn. And he said, if you just copy my plan, this is you will get perfect results every time. And this is his plan here for a military band. So there's no singers here. You can see there's 3 horns, and he's very precise about where the musicians should lie. And if you follow the lines of the edge of the horns, you'll see how certain musicians lie in relative to that. So he had a very clear plan. The minute his letter was received by colleagues in London, they all said, no, rubbish, that's wrong. I've got a much better way of doing it than that. So it was an endlessly tweaked and manipulated method of recording. But for ethnographic material, the performers were very likely, or should really have been, static in their performance. So it's not always obvious when you're listening that you may be listening to something that sounds highly rhythmic, that sounds like it was or should be, or according to the ethnographer's description, music was typically performed while dancing or moving. It's highly likely, or would highly been preferable, if they were not moving when they were recorded. We saw a picture in the previous presentation of taken by Northcote Whitridge Thomas in 1913, I think in Sierra Leone, but it may have been in Nigeria, of someone moving very obviously around a phonograph. Although I suspect the phonograph, looking at the picture, the phonograph probably was not making a recording at the time. But if they were, the results were likely to be very poor at the time. But I actually digitized the Thomas cylinders at the British Library 20 odd years ago, and some of them do sound as though someone might be moving around the horn. Things come and go in a very difficult way. Another very difficult area around metadata and information is the speed. Are you looking there at the picture? Is the speed control on a Vienna phonograph, probably I think it's the Type 5 machine from the late 1920s. And you can see it indicates faster and slower, but it doesn't indicate any numerical values. So you have no idea of how fast you're recording when you make the recording, and then someone playing it back has no idea of how fast to play it in order to recreate the tempo and pitch of what they heard before. Obviously, ethnographic cylinders, commercial cylinders from the early 1900s standardized around 160 RPM, but there was no reason really for ethnographers to follow that. If they wanted to make a 3-minute recording on what is notionally a 2-minute cylinder, they would slow it down, and sometimes they would make it faster. I've encountered ethnographic recordings at about 80 RPM, and I've encountered some that are higher than 210 RPM. So you have an enormous range in the middle of that. And in any event, if your playback machine does not have an indicator with numbers, how do you set your machine at 160 RPM or any other noted speed?
I can answer that one later.
Well, I'll give you one answer, and you can give us several more probably. So one, if you're setting it, if your notional speed is 160 revolutions per minute, and you know that the machine has a feed screw of 100 revolutions per inch, then you know that effectively your machine should be, your cutter or your replay style should be moving at 1.6 inches per minute. And in early trade magazines, they indicated that if you cut a piece of paper of a certain size, and then like taking your own pulse, and then time the movement of the cutter, it should move according to the length of the piece of paper. And if it was too fast, then it would be too far, and so on. But for ethnography, where you don't know that how to do that or what the speed was, then you have a problem. There were some attempts in ethnographic world. Thomas, Northcote Whitridge Thomas, used a pitch pipe sometimes, but he didn't write down what the pitch was. In some occasions, he would announce what the pitch was, but he's announcing it some distance from the horn. So if somebody shouts, "Yee!" at the horn, you then have to say, okay, well, it could be G, or maybe B, or C, or D. I'm not sure. So that was an issue. He did leave a pitch pipe behind, and someone later on in the records in Cambridge, they have a torn postcard, half a postcard, which has 4 pitches written on it. Which of the 4 did he use? We don't know. Sometimes they made transcriptions, and if you can assume that the transcription is reflective of the absolute pitch of the audio that was transcribed, then you can use that. In other cases where you have a large number of recordings, you can triangulate between them and say, well, this one sounds right if the pitch is about a D, and this one sounds right if the pitch is a C, or so on. So you can gradually work out, okay, I will assume that all these recordings are D, with a D pitch, and then I will digitize them or replay them all at that pitch, and then we can assume that if it turns out that it was a semitone sharp or a semitone flat, then they're all a semitone sharp or a semitone flat, is one way of doing it. But they're highly, highly subjective, and it relies on humans making that decision. I digitized one particular collection. In fact, ironically, it was a collection of English folk music on cylinders. And they had, like a lot of cylinder collections, they have been transferred in previous generations, either to cylinders or to magnetic tape or lacquer discs. And so one thing you want to do to minimize the wear and to maximize your sense of what you're working with is to listen to those previous transcriptions beforehand. And in one case, I was listening to a cylinder recording that had been copied onto magnetic tape, and it was recorded at quite a high speed and described as a female singer. And I listened to it and I thought, it sounds a little bit, and I tried playing it slower, and it seemed far more credible to me to be a male solo singer at a lower speed. And so I, consulting various other people, including some folk music experts, we agreed, no, it's a man, so we digitized it at the lower speed. But that's just my idea. Who knows? People often raise the issue of concert pitch and say, well, yes, these cylinders were made before, 1939, when concert pitch was standardized at A440. But really, in the scheme of things, whether it's A equals A440 or 439 or 444, that's really small beer in the levels of variance you're going to come across here. So it's the least of your worries to think about what the pitch pipe was set at. In terms of the cylinder itself that you're listening to, or the copy of the cylinder itself you're listening to, it's really useful to know, is it the original cylinder or is it a copy? And what's the nature of the copy? Thanks to Michaela Banal, who took these two pictures at the British Library for me. So, and following on from Zhao's discussion, that really interesting discussion about copying and about wearing down items when you listen to it, and about whether items were used purely for transcription or used for future listening for audiences. This was a very live subject, and it's, again, another subject that's not, to my mind, not been fully researched, and some really interesting things will come out of it, I think. The ethics of reusing this material were a very live topic, particularly not just for researchers on the one hand, but also for archivists or museums, more to the point, afterwards. Many people offered sound recordings to the British Museum in the early years of sound recording. People from the Edison Company in London in the 1890s and their successors after that. Commercial companies all said, we have the great voices of wonderful people in the past, era-defining performers. We would like these to be heard by future audiences, and the natural place is the British Museum in the UK. The British Museum always said no, because it contravenes a key rule in a museum, which is that you will not destroy the thing by accessing it. So if you look at a Roman coin or a statue or a jug in a glass case, you're not wearing it out by looking at it. But if you play, whether it's a gramophone record or a cylinder, if you're wearing it down by accessing it, you're breaking the golden rule of working in a museum. No curator will countenance any such thing. Now, the commercial industries were very adamant that the materials be in the museum, partly because they wanted to legitimize what they were doing. They wanted people to think of recordings of Nellie Melba, and not just as entertainment, but as high art, on a par with a Greek statue. So they wanted the public to think of it in that way. So they came up with an idea that they will present the British Museum not just with discs, but with metal stampers, so that the British Museum then has the means of sustainably passing on the material to the users. So they did that with a big fanfare in about 1908. They presented metal stampers in incredibly heavy brass caskets with the engraving of "This contains the voice of Nellie Melba" or Tolstoy or whoever else. The British Museum never once made use of the stampers, but they kept them for decades. They're now in the British Library, so they do survive. And the same thing in other forms of archives. when Thomas, who was in Nigeria and Sierra Leone, he was a government anthropologist. He has a very interesting role. He was making recordings for the British government so that the British government could impose law in a way that didn't completely contravene local custom. If you do impose that kind of law, you just don't get anywhere, nobody follows it. But if you can understand local customs and then impose laws that somehow make use of them, then you will have a more effective administration. And Thomas was working for them, and therefore a lot of his research was published in government publications about language and customs of Nigeria. And at the back of many of those publications it says, copies of these recordings that are transcribed in this book can be heard at the Pitt Rivers Museum or the Horniman Museum in London. Now we know the Pitt Rivers were given a large set of many of the recordings. There's no record that the Horniman Museum were, but again, our friend Lily Fraser, Mrs. J.G. Fraser, did make many copies of these for that kind of purposes. Another example of an archive tackling this question of copying was the first deliberate sound archive, the first archive that purposefully created a repository of sound recordings, the Vienna Phonogrammarchiv, which was formed in 1899. The earliest recording in their collection from 30th October 1899 is from a very eminent physicist, Ludwig Boltzmann, who said, among other things, "I believe that the original recordings will turn out quite well, but I doubt very much whether copying will really succeed." So that was their number one challenge at the beginning. And they didn't make any recordings for another 2 years because they wanted to work out how to deal with recordings. So the first way of making copies was to make pantographic copies. You take a cylinder on a mandrel, which has been pre-recorded, a separate mandrel which runs at the same speed, and have a cantilever between the two. On one side is a replaying stylus, on the other side is a cutting stylus, and it's like getting a key cut today. One moves the other, like so. Yes. Here's an image of a cylinder and a pantographic copy. Now, I'm not sure, there's something interesting about this. I don't know, what's interesting about this pair of pictures? Can anyone see anything? Yeah, perhaps, thank you. So the cylinder on the left is the master cylinder. That's the original that the recording was made on. The cylinder on the right is a copy of the same cylinder. Now, obviously, the one on the left is broken. It has a crack running all the way down it, from one end to the other, and it was bandaged to hold it together so it could therefore be replayed. That happened before the pantographic copy was made, because that very distinctive pattern of the crack can be seen as a sequence of ripples in the copy. So it's interesting that it tells us that the copy was made after the crack, but it's also another really nice reminder that the copy is not just a record of the original recording. It's a record of the experience of the stylus in the groove on the original. Hence, you see that the cutter bounced several times every time the replay stylus, and therefore the cutter on the pantographic side also bounced. So you will now hear that bouncing sound in every time you replay that one, because there's no way of avoiding that. There's another thing which I think is less obvious to you from where you're looking, but if you look at the angle of the crack falling down there, it's something like, let's say it's a vertical angle, but the angle in the copy is slightly different. If the one in the master crack is 6 o'clock, the big hand's at 6 o'clock, and the other one, it's at 5 o'clock. So this cylinder, when you replay it, will run at a slightly different speed. Again, not a huge one in the scheme of things, but it's an indication that either the two mandrels were not running at the same speed, or perhaps the circumference of the two cylinders was not identical, and caused the copy to be.
Do you think that
Okay.
I think you're right about the diameter of the cylinder, but I don't think it makes any difference to the apparent playback speed. It will cause that effect, but the rotational speed,
That's true.
linear
That's
speed will remain the same.
The surface
The
velocity
rotational
speed will change. That's right. The surface,
maybe
correct.
appear to be different.
All right. Whatever. So, pantographic copying was particularly prevalent in the UK. Lily Fraser, who made the box you can see on the left there, made many hundreds of pantographic copies. As I say, probably in an attempt to create an archive in the UK. It seems that many people who wanted to make sound recordings would contact her for advice on how to do it, perhaps to borrow equipment also, to receive, and she would archive, it seems, both the originals and the copies quite often, perhaps passing copies back to the people that they were made for. There's insufficient information as to how and why that was done, unfortunately, so far, but I hope that's improved in future. The other way of making copies with cylinders was to make a mold, a galvanic copy, and the molds tend to be known as galvanos. And the people who specialized in that the most, I think, in Europe anyway, were in Berlin, the Berlin Phonogrammarchiv. The two pictures here are of a Berlin copy, and I wanted to help people to identify these because it's particularly useful. I find these all over Europe in places where people think they hold an original cylinder. And I have to look at it and say, well, actually, no, what you have is a copy made in Berlin, which is potentially very useful to you because Berlin, in many cases, still have the galvanos and still have the technology to remake copies. So if your cylinder is very worn or cracked or broken, and they're often, these ones in particular, are very brittle, you can possibly get a brand new cylinder made by the Berlin Phonogrammarchiv. So how do you recognize these? Well, it's typically a black wax. You'll see in one of the pictures on the inside of it, there's a kind of chalky grayness to it, which is very distinctive. And if you look at the rim on the cylinder, you'll see the name, almost always the name of the person who made the recording carved into it, quite in a quite amateur, not very neat way, I'm afraid, and the number of the cylinder. So in this case, you're looking at a cylinder made by Georg Schünemann, and this is made in Uzbekistan in 1926. So I found this in an archive in Tashkent. They did not know anything about the recording or why they had it. The writing on the lid of the box was in German, and they had no idea why it would be in German. But because I recognized that it was a Berlin copy, I was able to contact Berlin and see through their discography that this was made by Georg Schünemann in 1926. And Berlin still has the full set of galvanos of 12 cylinders, whereas in Tashkent they only have, I think, 7 or 8 of the cylinders. So that's a nice kind of a happy story that those recordings survive in a better way than was originally thought. So galvanic copies, Berlin worked in a way perhaps similar to the way Lily Fraser was working in the UK. They would encourage people to send them their originals, and in return you would receive a copy back. Berlin would retain the galvanic negative, but they would also retain the ability to make unlimited or theoretically unlimited copies thereafter in the future. So it was a way of guaranteeing or improving the likelihood that your recording would survive in the future. So that therefore addressing this issue of perpetuity and so on. The British Library holds a large number of copies that were made in this way, and it's interesting to note from looking at them that Berlin would always, or it seems they always, when you sent them an original cylinder in a box, the original cylinder would inevitably be broken in the process of making a galvanic copy, but then they would send you a galvanic copy back in your original box. So it still had your metadata such as it was on the box. So I think it's extremely useful to know where in situations where multiple copies of a cylinder exist, it's useful to know that, and useful to know what kind of lens you're looking through at that cylinder. Are you looking, is it a master? Is it a pantographic copy? Is it a galvanic copy? And the difference in sound quality has not been studied much, but here's, if you're looking for a research project, here's one for free. When I digitized perhaps 2,000 ethnographic cylinders at the British Library, and hundreds of them were galvanic copies. Perhaps 100 were galvanic copies, several hundred were pantographic copies, made largely or entirely by either Lily Fraser or her assistants. Now, I'm sure I did many things wrong when I did that work, but one thing I did right was to always note down when I had encountered a master and a duplicate, and make a note of how they related. So any collection that I digitized that contained masters and pantographic duplicates, I would create a little table and say, here's a master, here's the copy, here's the master, here's the copy. I did them all in the same I did the master and the copy at identical speeds, and I did them all in the same equipment. So if you wanted a test set of several hundred comparisons between masters and pantographic copies, there's your test bed. And they're already digitized, they already hold them as audio files. So I'm sure the British Library themselves would be interested in the results of such a project. So if you wanted to know how pantographic copies differ from masters, there you go, fill your boots. But it's not just cylinders. The Phonogrammarchiv, as I mentioned, spent 2 years coming up with a solution to the problem of how to copy things. And in 1901, they produced the results. They did not use wax cylinders in the end. They came there with their own format, which they called the Phonogramm or Phonograph. You can see here one of the models. I think this is the type 4. Excuse me. There were 5 different types of recording devices through the years, and which became progressively more portable. As you can see, it's a flat disc format. The wax is a very similar color to ethnographic wax cylinders. I strongly suspect they were buying perhaps commercial cylinders and melting them down. I know that the gramophone company did this for many years in the early years to make wax discs for their commercial recording processes. If you look at the close-up photograph there, you will see that the cutting stylus assembly looks quite similar to an Edison Model C cutter, and I suspect in many cases it actually was. I'm not 100% sure.
Automatic.
Oh, automatic. What?
Well, or a Model C with the weight docked off it.
It's quite possibly a modified one, because they on the rare occasions when they did complete their own technical...
It's got the screw ring at the top, it's an automatic.
Thank you. They had a space in there from the beginning of their recording. They had what they called a protocol, where they wrote down some technical metadata, which sometimes they completed. And they would require to write down what the diaphragm was. And in some cases, they used some very interesting materials. Sometimes obvious things, glass or mica. Sometimes less obvious things like wood or oak was named Eiche, which is, I thought, rather curious. So after cutting the wax disc here, they would make a negative electroplated mold, and you can see in this image the metal object down the bottom. But they, unlike the flat disc industry, they did not press these onto shellac, but they used the mold to pour wax into and to hand cast a positive copy that could then be played and replayed. And this was the method used by the Phonogrammarchiv up until the 1940s. During the Second World War, their collection of wax blanks was destroyed during a bombing raid. Thankfully, the metal negatives were stored elsewhere and survived. And in the 1960s, they experimented with more durable ways of making copies. And you'll see that the yellow disc here is a copy made in epoxy resin. which they have been using to replay these recordings ever since. I'm quite sure in future there will be a way of making an optical scan of the metal negative, but until then, the epoxy resin copies work extremely well. They're not straightforward to replay, I have to say. There are obvious issues with centering the disc on a turntable. This can be, obviously, the accuracy can be improved with a microscope, which we do have. It's a vertical groove. It's a very high speed, typically between 50 or 90 RPM. The recordist was required to write it down, and they wrote it down in steps of 10, so it might say 50 RPM or 60 RPM, but again, I'm not quite sure how they came to that conclusion. The very short diameter of the recording and the high speed and the vertical groove means that tracking these is incredibly challenging. So in summary, what are we hearing when we listen to ethnographic wax cylinders? So the pedantic point I've alluded to already, that we're never just listening to the cylinder itself, we're always listening to an ephemeral relationship between a cylinder and a replay system. And as we mentioned at the start, the system includes people and not just things. We often think of recordings as objective accounts of what occurred, but in doing so, we overlook the fact that replaying this recording is itself a performance, which if you look or listen closely enough, is not exactly repeatable. There are highly subjective characteristics, such as the selection of replay equipment, stylish shape and size, replay speed, etc., but also more subtle characteristics specific to their place and time. If you play a cylinder a second time, then the experience of the stylus will not be the same as the second time around. The first replay will have brought about, hopefully very minor, deformation of the surface, and also perhaps cleared away or moved any particles of dust or mold or nicotine within the groove. Often, a second replay after, if an item hasn't been played for decades or perhaps a century, playing it 2 times will result in a better replay the second time than the first for this reason. The replay equipment will function slightly differently. The oil lubricating the bearings, for example, may have been a little warmer the second time and more effective. If you're transferring the recording to another medium, then the capturing technology may be subtly different. If you listen to an audio file of any of the cylinders I digitized at the British Library, what you're listening to is my decisions and my skill or my lack of skill in making the transfer. So it's a performance of a performance. This isn't specific to cylinders or to acoustic audio or to analog audio. It applies equally, in principle at least, to digital audio too. So for example, compact disc technology was built from day one on the understanding that the interpretation of binary data from the laser when replaying a disc would contain errors. It was understood that this was not a possibility but an inevitability. The problem is solved up to a point by error correction mechanisms, which, if everything is working as it should, result in identical data on each replay. But if you have access to the right equipment, it is possible and interesting to monitor the amount of errors that a replay system is encountering. So playing a CD several times in a row will result in a different number of errors each time, hopefully all correctable. But the phenomenon is much more significant for cylinders for all the reasons discussed. So we should acknowledge that the sound we hear when we replay a cylinder, either directly from the cylinder or via a digital surrogate, is a manifestation of the idea of the cylinder recording, and that each manifestation is different. In addition to all this, our listening experiences themselves are highly subjective and reflect our place and time. So in 2024, we typically hear the limitations of cylinder recording systems, whereas 120 years ago, they heard the potential of cylinder recording systems. We are not capable of hearing what they heard, and the reverse would also be true if they were around today. So how is all this useful to you? It's a useful reminder, I think, that while listening to a cylinder recording from 120 years ago might be our most direct route to experiencing the past, it's not completely direct. There are some bends in the road, and the better you understand the bends, the better prepared you will be to interpret what you find at the end of the road. When we look at the past, we always look through a lens, and it's important that we also acknowledge and remember to look at the lens itself. Thank you.